except for people who can make moral hay of that in the short term to ratchet themselves up, to produce for themselves positions of authority that would not be available to them if they weren't able to weaponize
ends up getting assailed. Well, that's no longer a theoretical thing. it's a terrific way to avoid any culpability, because there's only the only way, as you well know, the only way to turn around resentment is, apart from gratitude, would be for the person of resentment to recognize that there is a reason why they feel resentment, and that there is a person who is responsible for the things that they are angry about, but that the person is themselves. This is, of course, such a profoundly disturbing, life-disturbing thing to acknowledge that almost nobody deeply embedded in resentment. I don't know why we always look for excuses. We always put it on other people. It's so hard to history of the Jews, the history of people pouring their resentments onto this tiny group of people for daring to continue to exist and thrive across societies. There's a history of anti-Semitism as that, as it is in our own days, the great explanation for where some people can pour their resentment. But the main thing that you have to counter, I've long said this to conservatives in my own country and elsewhere, is you have to address things at an equally deep level. And when people say, I can't remember if we've talked about this before, but when people say, for instance, how will the right respond to the left on this issue? You very often see things like, well, we'll need to do more house building. As well as in societies, this is eminently possible. You and I both know this. You can stand in front of a painting, and you could endlessly work out the cost that that painting what the cost of it had been. What the cost of it had been, for instance, were the people who worked in the workshop of this master adequately paid? Where there were paints that were sourced from specific minerals, were those minerals justly acquired, and were people along every stage of the process justly rewarded for providing the material? You could break that down. country of origin at some point in a school holiday by their parents. Because they might not particularly like, they may be told in their school in New York or in London or Ontario that they are living in a patriarchal, racist society. But wow, when they go back and see their friends and cousins in Bangladesh, they might come back with a different view. My view in general is that we in the West have undergone massive context collapse. societies. I think we have to turn it around. I don't think it's sustainable to continue to war on ourselves and on every part of our own history, not least also because we deserve the right to have heroes and heroic narratives and things of which we're proud. We absolutely have that right, as every other society in the world does. So I'm trying to do a more reasonable audit on an era which I think has been deeply unreasonable to itself. As I say, this is a Western on Western crime that is being committed. It is completely possible to mend it. And that's why this very, very depressing subject matter in some ways, I try, as you know, by the end of the book, to show people actually this is positive. This is a way out. And these are the ways out. These are the ways in which you can try to turn the era of resentment into a personal and wider appreciation of gratitude, and of getting things into a proper order, and of getting things into a proper sense of themselves, because my God, we need it.
I've been trying to conceptualize gratitude as a form of courage. No, well, because there's evidence for tragedy and atrocity, obviously, and everywhere, and that can make you despair. That gratitude is also part of separating the wheat from the chaff, right? Is that you want to appreciate the things that are of high value. And so I wanted to ask, maybe close with one more question. It's a complicated question. Maybe I'll put it in two parts. You know, in the biblical narrative, the first two human beings that emerge in any real sense are Cain and Abel. They're the first who are born rather than directly created. And it's a rather depressing beginning point because they're fratricidal brothers. And Cain is bitter and resentful. And Abel makes the sacrifices that are acceptable to God and flourishes. And it's because of that flourishing that Cain decides to destroy him. And the depth psychology that I've read and the literary criticism tradition that's emerged from that suggests in some sense that those are the earliest manifestations of two patterns of deeply rooted patterns of behavior. One you might regard as the spirit of Abel, and the other the spirit of Cain. And our era is characterized by this tremendous increase in the speed of communication. And it seems to me that that's produced an exaggeration of this battle. And it seems also to me in some sense that it is a theological battle. The anti-logos aspect of it is a theological battle. And that it has to be addressed in some sense at that level. And so I guess what I'm asking you is, well, first of all, what you think of those ideas, and second, if this is how this may have changed your views on, what would you say, the necessary truth of the religious suppositions that underlie the notion of the sovereignty of the individual? I guess that's...
Yes, I mean, I laid out in The Strange Death of Europe what I think of as being not just my own, but certainly modern Europe's current malaise in regards to the Christian tradition, and the difficulty of it. I think, as you've also said in the past, I've often tried to live with what Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, it said as the invitation to live as though God exists, which I thought was a deeply brilliant invitation, a very generous invitation actually from a soon-to-be Pope. I think, as I've expressed a number of times recently, that in any case, you need a tradition to come from in order to know what the others are, and the modern idea that, as it were, you can splash around among all of the faith traditions of the world as a child and come out more roundly formed seems to me to be doing everything exactly in reverse, and that that really the way in which a child to be reared is in one tradition so that they can then go out having been versed in one tradition and know the others, discover the others as they go along. But the complexity of that is something that only an adult can go through. You know, you can only understand the things that the traditions have in common if you know the one that you've come from. And you can only actually admire them, other traditions on their own terms, really, if you know and have some reverence for the one that you've come from. Otherwise, it's all just a sort of mishmash of yoga-like banalities. I certainly know how much I owe personally to this tradition, and I know my deeply complex, conflicted, and inadequate answers to it. It's, you know, I often have to fall back on quotes, but I'm not Jewish. I'm Christian by upbringing, but I remember somebody I mentioned earlier, late friend Rabbi Sachs. He once said to me, he said that Isaiah Berlin, a friend, was once asked what it meant to be a Jew, and he said to be a Jew is to have a sense of history. And Jonathan Sachs said Isaiah was almost right. And he said, and I said, what do you mean? He said, I corrected him. He said, to be Jewish is to have a sense of memory. It's a pretty good clarification. I think one has a role in society to have a sense of memory. And in that case, if you're from a society like I am, like you are, that memory is absolutely God-haunted and Christ-haunted, biblically haunted. And there's no way around that. I don't resist it. I long ago came to the same conclusion that Roger Scruton did, and he encouraged me to, which was at least don't war on it, you know. And there's many other things that are worth warring on, but unless and until the Christian religion was to return to the stage of that it was at in parts of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, there's no need to. I don't see the Episcopalian Church in America, for instance, as particularly requiring my critique. So I do have a complex attitude towards it, but I try to remain in dialogue with the religion, is the way I would put it, and not to close the door. I think that's one of the.
Well, I think I told you when we met, possibly, that the word Israel means those who wrestle with God.
Yes.
And that's very interesting as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
That's the nature of belief in some sense, is to wrestle with the notion of what constitutes the highest virtues.
Well, the former Bishop of Edinburgh was a sort of secularist himself by the end of his career, but a deeply distinguished and humanist figure called Richard Holloway once rather beautifully said that everyone assumes that the opposite of faith is doubt, but the opposite of doubt is faith, but it isn't. It's certainty. Certainty is the problem in that mix. So perhaps having conflicted views is inevitable, if not necessary. As for Cain and Abel, isn't one of the many things in that story the fact that, as so often in the early books of the Bible, the Torah, that you're being reminded that you're both people? I mean, that everyone has both of these things in their hearts, and that just as we, the path, both these paths are always open to all of us. Isn't that one of the things that we're being told?
Well, we're always tempted by the desire to get away with insufficient sacrifices, to cut corners and to not do things as well and at as much cost as we might. We're all tempted by, what would you say, the spirit of revenge that we might allow to inhabit us if we became sufficiently bitter. We're all tempted to tear down our ideals because they also simultaneously judge us. We're all tempted to shake our fist at God, but if that spirit gets the upper hand, well, the consequence for Cain is that his sin is so much that he cannot bear it. And I believe that if we in the West tear down everything of value because we've given too much sway to the spirit of resentment and revenge, the consequences for us all will be something so cataclysmic that we won't be able to bear it.
Well, and I couldn't agree more. And we come back to this thing that we don't know what it would be. If the men of resentment had their way in what they're doing and pulled everything down as they are trying to pull down all of our stories, all of our heroes, all of our history, all of our culture, read our culture as a story not of admiration for the world and learning from the world, but actually theft from the world. If they did this on everything and succeeded as they're doing at the moment, what is it exactly at the end of this, other than the other ways of knowing? What is it that lies there? And the one answer you can get for people is essentially a version of that thing that Tom Wolfe described in Radical Chic, the essay on the party at the Bernstein's apartment in New York in the early 70s that Leonard Bernstein, his wife, threw for the Black Panthers. And of course, Tom Wolfe fantastically destroys this obscene event where the liberal elite of New York are having canapes listening to these revolutionaries describing how they want to destroy and pull down the society they're in. And there's a wonderful moment in it where I think it's Otto Preminger, one of Bernstein's friends, is sitting in his chair, and he says to one of the Panthers, "But what are you going to do once you have pulled down all of the existing structures? But what are you going to do?" And he keeps pushing this panther on this until this Black Panther says, "You can't put a blueprint on the future, man." And Leonard Bernstein leans forward in his chair and says, "You mean you're just gonna wing it?" And that's really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who don't know what they're going to do. They're going to pull everything down and then wing it.
Well, if we undermine that which unites us, right, and if we're united around something like recognition of the value of the individual, the divine sovereignty of the individual, let's say, if we pull that down and destroy it, then it's the war of every conceivable group against every other conceivable group. That's the only alternative that I can see, because there's an infinite number of arbitrarily oppressed groups.
Absolutely, and I would just add a coda to that, which is, I think people should be very careful of what they wish for in this. As you know, at the end of the war in the West, I say, of all of the unpalatable answers, the one coming the way of the people who want to make this racial is worse than any. It would consist of saying, this thing that you believe is so appalling, right, we've been courteous enough. End of courtesy. Why don't we go to the Aboriginal peoples or the First Nations peoples for any vaccines? Why don't we find other ways of knowing for cancer cures? Why are all of these things products of the thing that you say you hate, and the people you keep, that for politeness' sake everyone says can also contribute and do in certain ways, but they're not better than this, that the other ways of knowing are actually worse? And then, if you say, oh, and by the way, that's not universal after all because you've told us it isn't, it's just ours. Wow, is the 21st century hell.
True that.
Well, as far as I can tell from delving into it, that the end goal of the spirit of Cain is hell.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And we've been warned about that for a very long time. In the background. Yes, well, the 20th century might not have been enough. I hope it was.
That's a horrible thought, but I agree.
So, This book is coming out April, you said 26th.
26th.
So it describes the battle of ideas that currently is tearing our culture apart, and I would say, in some real sense, destabilizing the entire world. And so people can read it and they can draw their own conclusions and see their own way forward. But it's an alarm bell, and it should be ringing loud. Anything else, Mr. Murray?
No, just to remind, I would just add, since you did say at the beginning that it was very depressing, it's also quite amusing. And then scream at everyone about how hurt they are. Because in actual fact, on a whole range of issues of what we're now reminded are historic wrongs, something like considerable restitution happened an awfully long time ago. I mean, you still hear people saying, it's extremely popular in American discourse, that America never addressed the issue of slavery. And you sort of think, well, fighting a long and bloody civil war about it would have been one obvious way that they clearly tried to address it. And even that today is poo-pooed. A number of contemporary historians say, oh, it wasn't really about slavery, it was a different power struggle. It never is about the thing that the thing was about. But I'm very keen to address these ugly, difficult corners of it. So I say, if you are interested in restitution, of making atonement for any wrongs in the past, you have to look at what actually has already happened in the past by way of atonement.
Well, there's also a Christian/Western or Judeo-Christian/Western philosophy of atonement, and that is that you atone for your shortcomings and perhaps for the unequal distribution of talents by trying to live a responsible, generous, productive, and honest life, and
Right.
that it's actually a matter of individual moral striving rather than something that should be conceptualized at the group level. And so I'm struck again, and still, I cannot understand, if you accept the notion that the willingness of one group to oppress another is in some measure a human universal, it's deeply characteristic of our history, and that the reason that that's wrong is that individuals shouldn't be subject to arbitrary compulsion, partly because it deprives the rest of us of their potential value as free agents, and partly because it transgresses against part of their essential nature that's intrinsically valuable. You can't oppose slavery on moral grounds, as far as I can tell, without implicitly accepting those axioms. And so then it's so striking to me that the people who are simultaneously accusing the West of these uniquely awful predilections accept one of the great propositions of the West as central to their entire moral doctrine, and then
Yes.
they accept it so centrally they don't even notice that it's true. They just think it's self-evident.
Yes.
Well, it's not so self-evident. Why shouldn't I oppress someone if I can get away with it? And why shouldn't my group?
Right, and then we have the one now, which is the form of oppression that presents itself in the guise of the victim. I constantly come back in this book to the people who present themselves as victims and are clearly the bullies. People who claim to be suffering from historic wrongs because it gives them a dominance that they would not otherwise have. I mean, let me give you two quick but quite significant examples of this. Two of the most celebrated writers of the last generation in America are Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi. Both of them have been recipients of MacArthur Genius Awards. Kendi is now the only holder, apart from the late Elie Wiesel, the late Nobel Prize winner and Holocaust survivor, of one of the most prestigious chairs in an American Ivy League university. Both of them have written memoirs that have been bestsellers and are highly feted and cited everywhere. And both of them have an origin story of racism that is absolutely risible. In the case of Coates, he describes a moment in one of his memoirs of getting into an elevator with his young child, and a white woman gets into the elevator, and he says, behaves dismissively towards the child. And Coates describes how he wants to sort of fling this woman against the wall and sort of throttle her for this act of racism. And at no point suggests that actually it's possible that the woman was having a bad day and it didn't matter who the child was, or that she was partially sighted or anything. There's sort of the immediate assumption is this is racism. We suffered it, and we suffered it so appallingly. I'm going to get a chapter of my book out of it. And Ibram X. Kendi's origin story of racism is equally risible, and it's that when he was at primary school in the US, as a child, on one occasion, a teacher in the classroom called on a white girl when a quiet black girl in the class also had her hand up and wasn't called upon. And Kendi gets an entire chapter out of this. And my suggestion on these cases is these people are presenting extremely minimal stories, risibly small stories of, I don't deny that racism exists in some forms today in America as in all societies, but they present these risibly small examples of racism in order to present themselves as a victim and then present themselves also as the judge and jury over everybody else currently alive.
It's also very different to say that institutions are corrupted or tempted by the willingness to use power, the motivation to use power, and that one of the manifestations of that is various form of arbitrary oppression. And to claim that that's the central guiding principle of the institutions and the societies. And that also begs the question, well, if you criticize the West, let's say, for its grounding in willingness to use arbitrary power and compulsion, what do you propose as an alternative, and why do you believe that alternative exists? I mean, does the alternative only exist outside of the Western structure somehow? What's there except power?
It's only power. It's only power, and power in this era, as you know, Jordan, comes through the claim of oppression. That power is best exerted in our era, first of all, by claiming that the person has been a victim of oppression. And secondly, by wielding that alleged oppression, sometimes true oppression, but by wielding it as a tool to beat others. So that, for instance,
it's also interesting that the only reason that works, let's say I claim moral virtue because I'm an anti-racist rather than a non-racist. Well, why does that work for me? Why do I have a platform? Why do I have any authority? Because
our era cares about racism. Only because our era doesn't like racism.
Which belies the central proposition, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if no one cared, if people were psychopathic expressors of power, and that was particularly true of Western people, they just say something like, well, yeah, what's your point? Try to do something about it. And you think that's wrong? It's just because you're weak, and I've got the power, and I've got you under my thumb, and to hell with you and your stupid ideas. But that isn't what people do, and when they're accused of being racist in the West, they're struck to the heart, generally speaking. They're ashamed of themselves. They'll bend over backwards to apologize. They scour their conscience to see if they can find any example of where they might not have abided by the principle of divine sovereignty somehow, and make obeisances in every possible direction. And so that in itself seems to indicate that the primary claim is fundamentally untrue.
Which, as you know, I write a chapter in the book, as you know, on what everyone else in the world is doing whilst we're doing this to ourselves. And one of my favorite examples, I quote a lay colleague of mine's work on this, is racism within China and racism from China about the rest of the world. But there's a term that the Chinese use of white people that roughly translates as ghosts. The idea being,
I call them zombies. But that's all colors.
The idea is, of course, is that white people aren't really human. Like the simulacrum form of a human being, but not the real thing. Only the Chinese people are the real thing. Well, that's really racism for sure. And from the most heavily populated country on earth, and there's no
And
shame
one
about
certainly
it.
willing to use power.
And one certainly willing to use power. So it's an oddity.
So it looks to me, for example, I've tried to make this case that the central animating spirit of the West is something like the spirit of voluntary association, the spirit of voluntary cooperation, uncompelled choice, recognition of universal human dignity. Now, we all fall short of acting that out and instilling it in our institutions, and I see that as a reflection of that deeper theological claim that we discussed earlier, that each individual is in some sense of divine worth intrinsically, and should be treated as intrinsically worthwhile as a consequence, and that out of that, as far as I'm concerned, emerges the entire tradition of natural rights and their a delineation of the notion of that intrinsic worth. That's not the expression of the will to power, it's the precise opposite of that. And so,
Yes.
why are we so loath to give ourselves credit for the emergence of that idea and our attempts to abide by it? Why are we so prone to guilt in this regard?
Firstly, we would go back to that thing that it's regarded as being somewhat gauche and backward and unsophisticated to take such an attitude. And the second is that it is a second, and there are many other reasons, but a second is a completely misinformed idea, and this comes from America in particular, I'm afraid. It's what America has been pumping around the world in recent decades. The idea that what is bad in the West is uniquely bad, and that comes from a complete and wholesale ignorance, not just of history in the rest of the world, but the rest of the world now. I mean, a total, startling lack of context. I mean, if anything ever suffered from context collapse in our era, it is everything to do with the West. So that it is seen as...
There's another element that... there's another element that seems to me to be worthy of note, too. We're tortured for our moral insufficiency because of the existence of demonstrable inequality. And the call for equity is part of the clarion call for the people who are conducting, let's call it, the war on the West. And the proposition there is essentially Marxist, that wealth tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people, which happens to be true, although those people differ. The proportion is small, but the people change. But what's so faulty about that, in my estimation, isn't the claim that that inequality exists, or even the claim that there are negative aspects of that that might need to be addressed, but the notion that that is somehow unique to the social institutions and the economic institutions of the West.
Yes.
I hate that most particularly because
exactly.
I think it underestimates the problem. You cannot blame inequality on
Yes.
capitalism.
No,
It's foolish.
Absolutely. I mean, let's take the other options on the table. The remaining flotsam and jetsam of the Cold War. Let's say you could say Putin's Russia. You could certainly say Cuba and a few other places. What do we reckon is the inequality of wealth in these countries between, let's say, the oligarchs and the average Russian? There was a documentary Alexander Navalny bravely made before going back to Russia and being imprisoned, and he had it released after he got back to Russia the other month and was promptly imprisoned. He had the release of this documentary called Putin's Palace, and one of the extraordinary things which did a lot of harm for Putin at home, because people were genuinely shocked and upset about this, was that Putin's palace on the Black Sea, which he's been building for years at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, has, among other things, a vineyard attached to it, and there's a guest area, a guest room near the vineyard, and there's a guest lavatory in the guest room, the vineyard, and there's a lavatory brush there made of gold that costs the same as the average Russian makes in a year. So there's just one example of inequality in Russia. We could do the same thing for Cuba, and let's look at all of the other examples.
How about North Korea?
Post-colonial. Look at North Korea. I've seen myself in a country which I visited many years ago, but in a country where the general population starved by the millions in the 1990s, and the military elites were able to get hold on the black market of blue label Johnny Walker, one of the most expensive whiskies on the planet. Take any of it, because everyone talks about the post-colonial, I mean, of course, there's post-colonial societies that haven't gone well. There have been post-colonial societies that have gone very well, like Singapore, in terms of productivity. You could say that